Welcome back, everyone, to the Attuned Therapist podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Tatum, and today I'm honored to introduce my guest, Karen Ihrig.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining me. Will you take a moment and introduce yourself to everyone so they get to know you like I do?
Absolutely. So I am a LCSW. I'm newly in private practice, so I created my own private practice here with You Therapy. And that specializes in traumatic grief and loss through the MISS Foundation. I'm a compassionate bereavement care provider. I'm also certified in the NeuroAffective Relational Model. So that's a developmental trauma therapy approach. I also have a really strong niche with the ethical non-monogamy or poly community and anybody under the LGBTQ plus umbrella. I also have been in the field for about 15 years since undergrad and about 12 years since grad.
And you're also locally based here with me in like the Phoenix, Tempe, Scottsdale area of Arizona.
Yep, so I am an Arizona native. I grew up in Tempe, and I actually have an office there to meet with clients 2 days a week. So Tuesdays and Wednesdays I'm in office, and then the rest of the week I'm virtual.
Awesome. So you, when you were introducing yourself, you have such a wide variety of needs that you work with the clients that you work with. Like I could just hear you speaking from several different areas of need.
Yeah, it feels pretty eclectic. I didn't even mention my therapeutic art history. So there's just a bunch of different passions that I hold. The grief piece, I definitely dived into during the pandemic, but I had some experience with that before from taking classes in grad school under Joanne Cacciatore, who does the MISS Foundation. And then during the pandemic, I found such an important need to feel competent and to provide a really compassionate, bereavement care for traumatic grief. And then personally, I'm part of the queer community. So it feels really natural for clients to find me that way.
And then I'm realizing that I know the acronym NARM, but I could not repeat the full name back to you. Can you say that again for me?
Yeah, it's the NeuroAffective Relational Model.
Gotcha.
So it has both the cognitive piece and then also the somatic piece. And it's a approach by Lawrence Heller, who was a therapist since the 70s and has experienced a ton of modalities and really wanted to integrate a trauma healing modality that worked in the present moment and that also really invited therapists to tune into themselves and to notice their own countertransference within a curious and compassionate frame where they can also explore how they impact sort of the therapeutic relationship and basically take care of themselves as a therapist while they're also providing, relational and attachment trauma therapy.
I love that. So how did you discover NARM or come across that for yourself?
I love the story because I actually discovered it through relationship. So my good friend is a therapist, and she took the training herself. And she basically, we were in person, in Arizona, friends for a long time, and then she moved back home to Chicago. So she would come and visit me maybe once or twice a year. And there was a gap in between where I met with her for 1 year, I experienced her, and then the following year, she seemed like a brand new person. She just seemed so settled, so connected to herself, so mature, which in NARM, they talk about the adult consciousness. So we can talk a little bit more about that later. But basically, she just really had so much healing work herself that I instantly experienced her differently in a new way. And I had to ask about it because, of course, I wanted that for myself. And she introduced me to NARM, and she just told me a little bit about it, the survival strategies that we develop during childhood and then carry into adulthood as our patterns that no longer serve us. And I instantly resonated. There's one called attunement, which you could maybe resonate with, where if we in childhood have misattunement from our parents, where our needs are not met, we learn to disavow our needs, to ignore them, neglect them, to really not tune into them, to stay in relationship and to survive. And so instantly I was like, that's me. um, and then so I decided to read the book, and it really impacted me that much more. And then I decided to do the therapy for myself for about a year or so before taking the training. And then I took level 2, which there's different levels. So there's like a basic level for providers of all kinds in the caretaking fields, nurses, whoever, and then there's a level 2 specifically for therapists and licensed professionals, and then masters and postmasters after that.
So, sitting here with me as you reflect on that experience, to me, it sounds like that was pretty life-changing to discover that in your friend and then go through the experience that it led you into.
Absolutely. I could talk the whole podcast about how it's been life-changing because it's just so significant. On a deeply personal level, I was in my survival strategies where the attunement piece, there's also an autonomy piece where it's difficult to say no, hard to have your own sense of autonomy, where being in connection with people, feels like you need to be the good girl or people please, but then you have your own internal experience that's different than that. But anyway, so I really gravitated to those two as like my mains because there's 5 total. um, and doing the healing work around that, I feel like I have a new life. I feel like a new person. I've opened up so much more capacity within myself for connection, to have agency and make my own choices around what I want and need that I feel is right for me, rather than being on this automatic drive of I need to overwork, overgive, expend myself to be in connection and feel worthy or feel valuable. So just how I relate to my whole self in life has completely shifted after my own therapy work. And then going through the training and really deepening into the learning and the behind the scenes of the approach, which has different pillars, and it's very complex, but it's so nuanced and relational and heartful. They talk about heartfulness, where it's really a process of coming home to yourself and your heart, even as a therapist. So I tend to get really excited and geeky when anybody asks me about it, because yes, it's changed my whole life.
Well, yeah, and I would imagine most therapists listening to this episode can relate to those strategies because when you describe them, they would naturally lead someone to a career of helping, right? To be more attentive to the other, to be more focused on the needs of others or the environment around. To overextend ourselves is something that our profession, as we enter into it, unfortunately encourages us to do. And so I would imagine most people listening can relate to whether being in recovery from those strategies or perhaps even noticing them still present day for themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's NARM holds that our survival strategies are actually brilliant because they helped us stay alive. They served us then. But then when they carry into adulthood, they end up getting in the way of what we want for ourselves. They interfere with our relationships. And so for therapists, it feels really familiar and good to be in this caretaking role that is overextending, And there's even a term for it in NARM called unmanaged empathy. So you can
Oh,
even hear in the term like unmanaged empathy.
mm-hmm. Yeah. So, as you're talking about this, I'm thinking about as an individual, how radically life changing an approach like this could be. But also for you, knowing that you went through your own therapy and then got trained in the modality, I would imagine you as a therapist and how you show up in the therapy room has also radically changed for you.
Absolutely. I just want to name too that in the training, they built into the training room for therapists to do their own work. So there's these practices called active coaching where you are the therapist and you practice, but you have an active coach that pauses and checks in with your, if you want to be certified, requirements, but also just invitations to do what they call experientials. So where you're in the client seat and you have like a master trainer or, a NARM therapist who's very skilled guide you through the NARM therapy process as a client, but also will show you behind the scenes. So I had that in addition to my own therapy, but if you are a therapist going into the training, that's already built in for you. But yeah, so I definitely have changed just how I show up. Well, in all levels of my life, but especially as a therapist, because it really helps you tune into what they call your 50-50. This idea that as therapists, when we're not having transference that acts out on our clients, that we're, having a really balanced relational connection. It's 50%, ideally, it's 50% connected to yourself while also 50% with your client. And a lot of times that will be imbalanced. So as a therapist before, I was probably like 90% with my client and 10% with me. Or if I was having a really bad day, I was probably, 75 with me and maybe, the other with client. But just being able to attune to yourself and to reflect where you are, it just builds so much capacity to ground yourself and to also not take on responsibility that isn't yours in the therapist seat, where like that unmanaged empathy can make us feel responsible to fix it or do something or know all the things. But that's actually not our responsibility. And a lot of times that is an acting out on our clients from our own survival strategies that can harm them or impact the relationship or actually misattune to them.
So interesting, or even be harmful to ourselves. Yeah. 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 I'm thinking when you were sharing that, I was even thinking about how being imbalanced in that way um, can come up when we as the therapist are put in a position or placed in the position to maintain or uphold a boundary professionally, and that it'd be a very
Mm-hmm.
easy slippery slope if we are more attuned to the client and our perception, right, of what they need from that imbalanced perspective of ourselves, where those boundaries are going to get crossed or just not be clear or not be consistent, which is again that is going to create that misattunement you were speaking to.
Yes, I think the NARM approach has really been very significant for me in just the awareness and compassionate curiosity. So as therapists, when we're in our own survival strategies, or child consciousness is what they call it, like when we're in this psychobiological state where we're seeing through our trauma lens or we're acting out of our survival mode, survival patterns, then it can be, you're just almost like so unaware of what you're doing. Like you're just kind of in an autopilot. It feels good. It feels familiar to do this. It may even feel like the right thing. And honestly, in our field, it's what we're told to do. To sacrifice yourself, work late, not want, for a decent salary, like just be the martyr. That our system actually exaggerates or really requires us to be in this attunement survival strategy state where we're going against what's actually right for ourselves. And so it's a real game changer to like notice this within you and then to develop the agency around it to make choices for yourself.
Keep thinking about like as an example to what you're speaking to, the relationship that we as therapists have with late cancellation or no-show fees, and the just all the different perspectives on how to handle that, and all the different dances relationally that we as therapists have with our clients around that. Because I often see there to be a lot of dialogue of, you know, why would I charge a client a late cancellation fee if I myself, as the therapist, might need to late cancel at a certain point, right? And I see a lot of people, my personal perception is that it's compensation from a imbalanced place to say, well, I'll give them a freebie if I have to late cancel. And that's interesting to me because the relationship isn't reciprocal in that way. It's not a friendship. It's not a partnership in that way. It's not that we pay our clients and they pay us, right? We are it's a professional relationship, but quite an intimate one. And there's a way to honor and uphold that as the therapist while also upholding the truth that there is a service being paid for. And that late cancellation fee isn't a punishment for canceling late. It's just meant to
Right.
honor the business model that we as the therapists are trying to uphold for ourselves, and that this is our livelihood, our financial security. But I see a lot of discussion and opinion and perspective around that fee and what it means to charge it, and what does it mean for us as the therapist if we then down the road are in a position to late cancel. And I'm in no way trying to say a certain perspective is right and another is wrong, but I can just kind of hear in what you're speaking to, how historically I think our profession has encouraged us to kind of see ourselves as equals in that way when it is different. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. It makes a lot of sense that we learn and maybe aren't even aware of how much we've internalized these values in social work, that it's like, oh, I just need to just waive that fee because it feels better for my familiar pattern, and also for them, like it's offering them an allowance, like I need to give more to them so things are okay. But within the NARM perspective too, it's like when you overextend or have unmanaged empathy and you're overgiving, you're actually taking away the client's agency to choose for themselves. It's like you're making them more in a child role, like, oh, you can't choose that for yourself, I'm just going to take care of you. But if you think about it, if your policies feel right in your system, this is right for me from the start, and they agree to it, that is their agency to choose to honor your policies, And of course, there's going to be emotions and reactions around it from clients. Like, we all have our emotions when stuff like that happens. But if you can be connected to yourself and why that felt right to you from the start, and you can ground into your own adult consciousness where you feel like you have made your decisions out of your own integrity, then there really isn't a right or wrong to that answer. It's just what's right for you. And are you honoring yourself, or are you kind of running from what's right for you because you feel like this is what's needed from, like, the values from our social work learning, or just from your own upbringing, your own patterns where you learn to disavow your needs and to just overgive before you give to yourself.
speaking to, there's going to be emotions around it. It's like we teach clients all the time that just because someone has a strong emotional response to their boundary doesn't make the boundary, quote, wrong, or that it shouldn't have been identified, right? Like those are two different things. And I appreciate in how you're describing NARM, the ethical emphasis that it creates, just like a natural ripple effect is that if the therapist is showing up in that adult consciousness and they're also viewing the client in the same way, that there's this natural ethical practice that ensues, right? Because there is that respect of their autonomy, and also then as you start to look further out, as you're working with many clients, you're seeing them as equal and engaging with them in a just and fair way, and those are all ethical principles guiding us. So I'm very appreciative of this model and what it's encouraging for the practitioner uh, utilizing it.
And, you know, within that perspective, from a NARM lens, it's like we expect our clients to have child consciousness. Their strategies are going to come up. They're going to, quote unquote, do therapy like they do everything else. That's why they're here. And from the relational trauma healing, we create an environment where we don't, quote unquote, collude with their strategies. We don't, get in this enactment where, okay, I'm just going to give in to your strategy that wants something that's familiar and not helpful to you. And then I'm in my strategy, and let me give an example to this. Like for therapists who tend to overgive or have trouble saying no, and then a client comes in and they're like, well, I just want you to fix it. And then the therapist might have this strategy come up, their child consciousness being like, oh, I just need to fix it. I need to be a helper. I need to, do this dance with them where they try to be in roles that are actually not helpful, because the client, it's not about you fixing it for the client. It's the client having their own self-inquiry and arriving at their own inner solutions or inner trust, their own self-trust to navigate it for themselves.
Wow. Okay. So as I'm having this conversation with you, I'm realizing how much emphasis NARM has on human development and attachment theory and really any type of theoretical orientation to, childhood and adolescence, and how that development then impacts us as adults. And I so wish for our profession in our educational process that there was more emphasis on those type of theories comparatively to the theories from like 100 years ago, because you and I both know, and every therapist listening knows, that it's the therapeutic relationship more than anything else that's going to potentially have a positive impact on someone and what they're wanting to accomplish. And yet we're taught nothing about human relationship, or very minimal in our education, right? Like we're not taught that for our clients, how they show up to the therapeutic process and relationship is entirely informed by their early childhood. The social and emotional foundation for us as humans is from when we are very, very little. And it's very rare, I think, for new grad therapists to learn that how our clients show up is essentially from the expectation and assumptions created from attachment relationships. And so there's so much for the therapist to then work with if they have that foundation of knowledge, and there's a lot of then space in between us and our clients, right? To recognize like this is not about me as the therapist. This is about something that they previously learned. And it's showing up here whether they have the conscious awareness or not, but we can have that for them. We can have that curiosity. We can have that compassion, right? And we can have that interdependency rather than codependency or, too much independency away from our clients, right? Like we can show up in that dance of relationship with them in a way that's nurturing Which you and I see you nodding your
Mhm.
head. Like, I know that you and I have this foundation of learning for ourselves as practitioners, but I mean, you and I also both know that so many people don't. And it just makes my heart go out to therapists who aren't functioning from that framework. Because I would imagine it just gets so complicated and heavy without it.
Yeah, I remember, being a therapist for many years without learning NARM or really having this framework. And the pressure I put on myself was so intense. And it's interesting how even NARM can name that, because we talk about shame and self-pressuring and all that. We don't say, oh, I feel this happened and shame came, or I feel this. It's shame is an act that we do to ourselves. I'm shaming myself in this moment. I am pressuring myself to be a good therapist in this moment. And even though that sounds almost, it could sound like blaming or it could sound like a judgment, but really, when you're in the client seat and you feel the agency and autonomy to notice that you are doing something to yourself, then there creates this hope and this movement around it, the spaciousness around it to maybe do something different, you know? So, like, the old me would come to a podcast like this and be like, oh my gosh, I have to be perfect. I have to say everything right. I have to be knowledgeable as a therapist. I have to show that I'm a good therapist. Like, after NARM, I get to humanize myself and subjectify myself, where it's like I can allow myself and give permission to just show up how I am. And that is pretty much the whole foundation of my practice now that I'm creating a private practice. I even kind of market that a little bit as like, let's be human together in the room. Let's give ourselves permission to, settle into our authenticity. And that naturally creates spaciousness, heartfulness, connection, and this room to not be in those survival strategies, to just notice it and to have this new sense of freedom, or however it shows up for you. But it just creates this so much hope around like being able to do something different than just being in this self-pressuring and this like grind of like um basically they also talk about self-attack, like basically where we self-attack around these different traumas that we had, developmental traumas that we had growing up, and we've just learned to do that to ourselves to keep in connection. And then the healing process is to gently, without pressuring yourself, notice and unlearn that and do something, relate to yourself and others differently.
And I'm hearing there must be a high emphasis on the body and somatic awareness within this modality because you're referencing a sense of present awareness. And in that present awareness, having like a choice, right? You're not just reenacting or embedded in an experience, but rather
Mm-hmm.
you're a witness to an observer and a leader of that there's choice and power, and recognizing these strategies and how they're showing up presently,
Mm-hmm.
and there being a capacity and capability to do something different.
Absolutely. The model is really integrated between the body-based somatic and the cognitive. They call it top-down and bottom-up, where a lot of the sessions are structured around inviting self-inquiry and self-connection. So you'll ask questions like, what are you noticing right now? You know, how is it to hear me reflect that? Or just a lot of different techniques in inviting someone to grow their capacity to even be in tune with what's happening in real time. Um, and it's really beautiful. So like a lot of people are very disconnected from their body. And we know as therapists and trauma informed, like that's a natural and sometimes very important thing to happen. So it really is titrated and tailored to the client's own capacity in real time. There's never like, unlike some somatic work, you may find, oh, like let's be in your body. That's not what NARM is. NARM is really kind of assessing the capacity and having gentle invitations that are client led. When they can go there, they'll go there, and they'll grow that capacity over time to be more connected to themselves, their body, and it happens in relationship too, even connected within relationship.
Sure, but I mean, I would imagine the approach for you as the therapist is very much informed from like a polyvagal theory perspective, that for us as therapists to be available to connect, we presently would require some level of somatic awareness of ourselves and connection, that we aren't available to be present and connected to our clients and therefore be that like lighthouse for them if we're not attending to what's going on
Right.
within us, right? Yeah. That's so interesting. This
Right.
model incorporates so much.
Yeah. Yeah. And I haven't talked about, it's so complex. It just kind of goes on. And as you continue to learn
Mm.
it, the learning goes from your mind or your head deepening into your body. And it's incredible. It's almost like a frame of viewing the world. And that sounds maybe a little strange, but like it's an embodied perspective that shifts and changes after you learn it. Like I can have a really hard day, and maybe before NARM I would be pressuring or shaming myself about it, like, oh, you just are this, or you need to do that, or whatever. But now I can even just like pause and observe, oh, I'm in child consciousness right now. This is a pattern that's coming up. I can see that. And I'm going to choose to be more gentle to myself around it. And you can imagine as a therapist, especially with clients that bring up your own countertransference, like instead of being like having the message that we've internalized to, oh, we should just not have countertransference, we should just take care of that, just like put it aside, just be with the client, to use your countertransference as information that is from your own wisdom, that is in tune with yourself, that really helps you in the therapy room be a more effective therapist, where you're not acting in or acting out on people.
That's so interesting. So I didn't learn this through NARM. It's not something that I'm trained in whatsoever, but there's um oh, I hope I remember the author's full name. The book is titled Attachment in Psychotherapy, and I believe the author's name is David Wallen. Gosh, I hope I'm giving appropriate credit where credit's due. I'm so bad with names, but it was such a life-changing read for me as a therapist, because yes, the book goes into attachment theory and like just all the information about that as a foundation, and then the majority of the text is dedicated to describing and going into the nuanced way that our client's attachment system and style will show up, not might, but will. And it was so interesting to read because, for example, if a client in their own prior experiences is informed that an attachment figure is going to show up with anger, that the client will subconsciously engage in a way with the therapist that elicits some level of anger in the therapist. Or if the client
Mm-hmm.
anticipates a dissociative, dismissive, inattentive response, that they will elicit, consciously or not, some level of that in the therapist's mind and or body. And that was such a powerful intervention for me to learn, and recognizing like, okay, that can be my own shit. I could be very off that day. I could be having something that happened that
Mm-hmm.
morning with my family that I am irritable about. Or I can be sitting there with a client and go, oof, I'm starting to feel a certain level of fuzziness in my body that wasn't there before. And since learning that, I have sat with so many clients and been able to recognize their dissociation before they named it. And it gave me an opportunity to
Wow.
intervene and to be curious about it with them and help them bring awareness to it and or focus to it, rather than it just kind of being this thing happening. Yeah, it's like I've learned to use my body in
Absolutely.
such a
Yeah.
powerful way with clients of, hey, it feels like this just came into the room. What are you noticing?
Absolutely. Yeah. And to go back to NARM, like they have language for that. So there's this concept of the big C and the little c. So big C is like your countertransference that we all know, like, oh, I'm triggered, something's happening in me, I'm noticing this. A little c is actually thought to be more that you're attuning with the client so well that you are picking up their experience. And that was really mind blowing to me too, because so many clients I'm like noticing, just like you said, oh, I feel this anxiety, but that doesn't feel like mine, or this is happening in my body or in my emotion, and this feels like, is this mine? And rather than self pressure or self shame, like, oh, you're just anxious in session or whatever, it's like you can be
Mhm.
curious around it and check in with the client. And a lot of times if we're authentically connected with our client, if we're attuned to them and we have the intention to be present with them, we pick up more than maybe we even realize.
Yeah. And I think that clients also equally pick up us as well. And going back to that, like how I conceptualize it as like polyvagal theory, it sounds like NARM just incorporates that within its own language, but that there's a certain level of
Does you?
presentness for us as therapists that if that isn't available to us, that is absolutely noticed by clients, right? We can't fake being in a connected state if we're not. But that's not something we say, that's something we show and convey with our bodies, and our bodies aren't capable of lying about that.
Nice. Absolutely. There's this phrase in NARM that I love. It's like, you can't bring a client to where you haven't been yourself,
Mm,
you know? And it's like, if you're not doing your own therapy work, if you're not attuning to yourself, if you're not connecting to some sort of inner spaciousness, inner quiet, your client's going to pick up and match that too.
it's such a robust model, NARM. When you really start to talk about it and dive into it, it encompasses
Mhm.
so much in a very beautiful way.
Definitely. And it's not super well known yet. And so a lot of, therapists or networking I do, people don't know so much about it. Um, so I'm really excited to, see people start to learn about it, start to explore it. Um, because, I'm a little biased. Like we talked about, it's been so life changing that I, it's, it really helps the therapist not have burnout or not have compassion fatigue, um, by efforting less, by connecting to yourself and knowing your needs, addressing those, having agency around that, and not feeling so responsible to be everything for your client. And that is such an incredible gift as a therapist, to really hold that for yourself and allow yourself to be human as a therapist. I think it's honestly a little rare. I don't know if that's my perception, but I don't think a lot of therapists necessarily connect to that yet. And I'm really super excited, to just even have conversations like these and see what comes up out of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think you're speaking from a perspective of being trained in this model, but also having experienced its healing power. And that creates in you a certain level of security and confidence in what you then are doing with clients, right? Like you are that beacon of hope. You are that adult consciousness that's able to sit from that perspective of this is possible, you are capable, right? All the positive beliefs that we would want someone to hold for themselves, you're coming in from a stance of knowing that to be a truth that can happen firsthand. And that's not a facade, that's not something you were trained in, that's something that your physical body has experienced. And so I'm sure you like get everybody on board that you work with because they feel that sense of hope with you, right? And without even you disclosing anything of your own, right? You just show up in that way and available in that way.
Yeah, I think it's so true that doing the NARM therapy work before being trained has been such a wonderful experience. It really helped me go into the training with a more embodied awareness of what clients experience too. So,
Yeah.
because when you learn the approach, and I imagine this is for many approaches out there, but if you haven't done the therapy yourself, you're coming at it more of an intellectual kind of, oh, this is how it goes. But when you're in the therapy seat, especially for NARM, it is such an embodied experience. And if you've never tried it, that's why they have the experientials to really, have the therapist experience that, so they know what the client is going through on some level, because it's really powerful and it's like gentle and compassionate, but it's also very profound and sometimes um, confrontational, because it really calls to our attention what's happening with us, what's alive in us, and it also invites people to connect to grief and anger from their adult consciousness, where even though that's we think of anger and grief, and I don't know about you all, but it sounds intense, or it's a lot, or there's all these relationships we have to that. But what's really
Yeah.
curious about it is when you connect from a place of adult consciousness, it actually feels really good to feel it. It feels self-connecting. It feels like healthy boundaries. It feels like knowing yourself, feeling into that trust and truth for yourself. It's still difficult. Like, obviously, grief and anger is never going to be easy to feel, but it's so much different than kind of, having your child consciousness anger response, where it's very lashing out or pointing towards it in, or unmanaged grief. I don't think that's a NARM term. I just said that. But where it's just like, it feels like it's going on forever and ever, and you're never going to stop grieving, very, very different. And so it's really wild to even be in an approach that supports you in connecting to your feelings from a place of self-connection and really deep inner attunement.
Yeah. Well, I can appreciate what you're describing, in that, again, I'm not being trained in this model, but it being, so incorporative of other theories and modalities. There's something to be said to, if this
Mm-hmm.
childlike consciousness is going to orient to emotions in the way that developmentally would be age appropriate. Well, emotions are really big and overwhelming when they're distressing when we're little, because we're meant to still be dependent on co-regulation. So it's age appropriate for emotions to
Right.
feel big and for us to need help managing that, when emotions at their core are just cues coming up from the body, like when we're hungry or need to use the restroom. It's our nervous system. It isn't that emotions are by
Mm-hmm.
definition uncontainable or overwhelming. It's more, which consciousness are we showing up from? Because as an adult, sure, we still have co-regulation needs. We're social creatures, but we're not as dependent. We do have the capacity for self-regulation. So I can hear, even like from a developmental perspective, that makes perfect sense, that distressing emotions can feel more containable when we are showing up from a more adult-like presence.
Mm-hmm.
But even, I want to go back for a moment, because when you said it could even
Right.
be confrontational, I had this thought of, well, yeah, because you're inviting clients to be their own hero rather than the victim of their story, right? It's a call to action,
Right.
right? Of, oh, you can be the hero here. And
Right.
as we know, in all the fairy tales ever told, typically the hero denies the call of action at first. They're like, no, I don't think it's me. I think it's someone else. No, I'm not. I'm not the one. And then eventually in the story, they do
Mm-hmm.
finally decide to lean into that call, and they are the hero of the story.
Yeah, and it's really great too because it invites that hero role for yourself, but it also doesn't pressure or demand that you are the one that has to behaviorally do it, or you have to do this, or it's a natural just invitation of growing the capacity to be more in your adult consciousness, because we all have the child consciousness, we all have adult, but those states are really natural to us, but we can, through the approach and through um, having more agency online, so really feeling like we have choice, we're an adult, we're in control in some way, we can even know what we want or need, that naturally makes us sort of the hero and less of a victim, less helpless or hopeless.
I'm sure that you and I could spend hours on end digesting all of this together. And I, in a way of finding an opportunity to wrap up, even though there's so much more to say, I'm curious to hear more if you have anything else you'd like to share of in your journey as the human that has gone through both the therapy itself, but also learning the modality. You've been speaking to it every step of the way here today, how it's impacted you. But I'm curious if there's anything else that comes to mind um, that you'd want to share and how this has been changing for you and transformative for you.
Yeah, I just am holding, the huge difference for myself of shaming myself, self-pressuring, um, perfectionism, expecting myself to be this like therapist that I imagine to be, you know, the quality therapist or doing what I need to do. And then now, just giving myself permission to be authentic and human has relieved so much. They call it life force energy. Like it opens up this life force to really feel aliveness and to go for me personally, it's been like, honestly, to allow myself to be in private practice. I was in nonprofit spaces, community mental health for like 15 years. 15 years of, just pressuring myself to work too late, to do all the things, like, to just be everything within that role. And it's been so life-giving to just allow myself to, do something I'm passionate about. Like, NARM has given me a sense of I can be in this field and be so nourished and rewarded and feel such in this incredible community, because I haven't even talked about that, but NARM has an incredible community around it, where it's like, it just feels like I've given myself a huge gift that I wouldn't have before. And if there's anything I want to speak to other therapists, like, obviously, this is not an advertisement for NARM. You don't have to do the training or whatever. But I would hope that you give yourself permission to be gentle and human, and to give yourself a little bit more kindness and care and recognition of all that you give and all that you do, and know that that is enough. That has a ripple effect outward. One little interaction with one client can make a huge ripple effect. And, just basically honoring sort of what you're already doing and what you actually want from this role.
It's beautiful. I got chills, and when you said the gift that you gave yourself, and then without using this exact language, I heard you identify how you are now available to like give that gift to others, right? Like you have experienced it, and now you're then
Right.
available to demonstrate to others. That's beautiful.
Yeah. One little thing too, I know we're ending, but I honestly feel so much more capacity to even be connected. And that's a lot of what NARM does, is helping connection, right? Having capacity for connection. Before I would be so overwhelmed, I'd be so tired, fatigued, drained. that my capacity was so low for so much. And now I just feel like there's so many opportunities, like even doing this podcast. Before I would have maybe never said yes, because like, oh my gosh, what energy do I have to give to talk and hear, be heard? But
Mhm.
it's really wonderful how when you start to change your relationship, have more compassion towards your own strategies, very much like IFS, right? You treat your part in a different way and almost embrace it rather than disavow it or disown it. It just makes so much more room to experience life in its fullness. And that goes along with giving to others. Like you actually create more room to give to others.
Well, thank you for joining me today and sharing a little piece of this gift, right? I would imagine that you're going to connect with quite a few people's hearts as they listen to this, and you are your own beacon of hope. Truly. I hope you realize that in your
Oh,
reflection of where you've been and where you are,
thank you.
that as you're speaking from this place of truth for yourself, I mean, there's power in it, right? Because you're not oh, the term is on the tip of my tongue. You're not like dancing the line. You're not like, well, maybe I feel this way, maybe I don't. You come from such a place of clarity and sturdiness when you're speaking from that hope that you have. And so it has been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Of course, thank you for having me. It's been wonderful.
Yes, and thank you everyone for listening. We will talk with you next time.